A very good afternoon to each and every one of us, those of us in-house and those online. And as usual, we say a very big thank you for making time to join the IAS seminar series. Today, we have another interesting talk, which would be presented. And in our chair, we are very privileged to have Dr. Akrofi-Ansah, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of African Studies. She belongs to the language, literature, and drama section. And she has a lot of research in language, literature, and linguistics. And at this point, I would just like to hand over the microphone to her, and then she will introduce our speaker, and we carry on with today's seminar. Thank you very much, and welcome once again.
Thank you very much. Today we have Dr. Issac Mwinlaaru to present to us on the topic Agency, Resistance, and Decoloniality in the National Anthems of Anglophone Africa. The study examines the anthems of former British colonies in Africa as a textual space for resistance against colonialism and for performing decoloniality. It is situated within the notion of cultural trauma. Data is analyzed from a critical discourse analysis perspective. Resistance is enacted in the anthems by assigning agency to the colonized, thereby overturning dominant colonial narratives in order to reclaim a positive identity and project a desirable post-colonial future. The anthems also foreground the motif of freedom and legitimization of land ownership. The paper highlights the role of language in political decolonization processes. The speaker is the senior lecturer in the Department of English of the University of Cape Coast and a fellow of the African Humanities Program. Her specialization is language sciences with a focus on Africa. So without wasting much time, I'd like to invite Dr. Issac Mwinlaaru to do the presentation. He will have about 40 minutes within which he will present. And then afterwards, we'll have the questions and answers session. So you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the overview and the nice introduction and the welcome. I'm happy to be here in the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana. This is a place I like very much. University of Ghana has the most beautiful campus for me among the universities in Ghana, and very green. I always feel welcome and refreshed when I'm here. And besides, I have many friends here. And so I'm always at home. When I had the invitation to come, Dr. Tasiatu Abubakari gave me the options whether I want to do this in person or virtually. And I said, wow, once this is the University of Ghana, I want to be here in person. It's an opportunity to meet friends and make new contacts. So I'm happy to be here. And also have the opportunity to present in the Institute of African Studies. As my bio read, Africa is a place that is always in my heart. And I have a strong research interest on Africa. So it's good to be among colleagues in the African Studies Department, coming from an English department in Cape Coast. So the topic for today's presentation, as mentioned, is agency, resistance, and decoloniality in the anthems of Anglophone Africa, or otherwise former British colonies in the African continent. The presentation, I'll start with an introduction and give some background conceptual discussion and a brief description of data and methods. Then I move to the discussion and then I'll conclude. My interest in national anthems goes back as far back as 2012. When I started looking at them, the issue of decoloniality was not in my mind, but I thought they had a beautiful language. So I was exploring the language of these anthems from the framework of systemic functional linguistics, which is an area where I draw a lot of theoretical inspiration from in my research. I remember my first presentation was in 2012. There was this coexistence of languages in African conference in Cape Coast. I made a presentation just focused on the linguistic features of some of the Anglophone African anthems. I think at the time about 5 of them. So I went on to do other things, but returned to this just a few years ago, and I published a paper with one colleague, Mwinlaaru, on the anthems in critical discourse studies in 2 years ago. This presentation will largely focus on this publication, but recontextualized within the notion of decoloniality. So what you see here is a picture from Bandung. This is the Asian African Conference Hall, Bandung, where the Bandung Conference of 1955 was held between Asian and African countries, which were mostly colonized by the West. And it's an important conference because it defines or it contributed to the definition of the freedom struggle that led to the independence of many countries in Africa and Asia, and defined a strong collaboration in the fight against imperialism and establishing peace among nations. I was happy to be here sometime in 2016 and happy to see pictures and some inscriptions preserved there by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah from the first summit, the summit that they had in 55, and his Secretary General. So that is a colleague there from China, Dr. Wang Guo, where we were enacting the peace between Africa and Asia with a handshake. All right. And it's important because my work on African anthems inspired Wang Guo as well. And when he saw my slides at the time, I haven't published anything yet, he was inspired and went ahead and analyzed the Chinese national anthem, looking at the English and Chinese translations. His area is translation studies. So in decoloniality research has been varied and has produced a lot of intellectual discussion in sociology, in philosophy, African studies, international studies. In linguistic research, there is not much, but the few studies on decolonial research, looking at language, has focused on the speeches by freedom fighters, such as Dr. Nkrumah and Nelson Mandela, so far as Africa is concerned. And I think that one area that has been neglected, and which for me is very important, is the national anthems, which most of them were composed at the dawn of independence, and which defined the past and also the future of Africa at that very important juncture when we were being ushered from colonialism, previously coming back from slave trade to colonialism, then entering into independence. So I think national anthems are very important discourses. We normally look at them as symbols of unity symbols of nationhood, nationalism, and other things. But my research on them has also revealed that they are sites for performing identities and for showing resistance, continual process that lives beyond the independence and looks into the future of Africa. And as you see in the presentation, it's striking how similar the language of these anthems and the issues that they consider are across countries. So the study examines decoloniality in the anthems of former British colonies in Africa, looking at how decoloniality is constructed and performed. And my thesis is that the anthems serve as discourses of resistance in which the colonized assumes agency against imperialism. So with the conceptual issues, I'll talk about decoloniality and the notion of cultural trauma. And to set this study in context, somebody asked me if we are talking about national anthems that celebrate independence, why will we be talking about colonization or decolonialization or all of that? Because at independence, colonization has come to an end. But I want to distinguish between colonialism and coloniality. And on the other hand, decolonialism or decolonization, and then decoloniality. And this distinction is important in setting the stage for the relevance of looking at the anthems in the context of decoloniality in contemporary times. So this quotation from Mwinlaaru Torres makes a distinction that is important in this study between coloniality and colonialism. And colonialism, he defines as a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such a nation an empire. So colonialism brings with an administration set up by another country to control politically, economically, and in terms of sovereignty, another nation. Coloniality is different. It's a long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjectivity relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. So in a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. So coloniality goes beyond the colonial regime. In fact, even in time, it goes as far back as the beginning of slave trades, and even before that, at the beginning of the interaction with the West through Christianization and other forms of mental subjugation. So colonialism, which is about the political administration, is different in this sense. And our concern here is coloniality, which is more soft and which is a system that does not need the colonizer to be present in person in the continent or in a country in able to make it successful. So on the other hand, we look at decoloniality as dismantling the relations of power and conceptions of knowledge. In other words, we are looking at it as disrupting and reversing the effects of coloniality. So it indicates the struggles to bring into intervening existence and other interpretation that bring forward a silent view of the event and shows the limits of imperial ideology disguised as the true interpretation of the event in the making of the model, to make them the countries function more effectively and for the people, and respond to the daily needs, significance of people that have gone through colonization before. Okay. And the understanding is that the anti-colonial struggles that resulted in independence did not actually produce a genuine post-colonial period. We talk about post-colonialism, but what we actually see in the words of Mbembe is a post-colony, a colony, a new colony that emerged after the dismantling of the colonial administration. With this time, the colonizer at distance, but very much present in ideology, in the systems of authority, systems that define the economic structure of the world. In other words, the colonizer defines the world order in which the colonized continue to be subjugated and serves the interest of the colonized. So that is the understanding. And another concept related to this is cultural trauma, which the trauma, we know that mostly has to do with something physical, something clinical. But by cultural trauma, we are looking at a memory of an experience of a group of people, an experience that is negative and strongly affected their sociality and history, and cripples their sense of being, and cripples their sense of identity that needs to be dealt with and cured before they can reclaim their identity and forge a meaningful development. In the context of this study, the trauma here we are concerned with is the colonial wound, a consequence of systematic racism through systems like apartheid, through systems like the assimilation, the indirect rule systems that were set up, and many other forms of subjugation. The wound is also a kind of discourse that has been forged to promote hegemony and to put the West or Euro-North American systems of government and economy at the center and exclude the others that are to the margins. What is the data for the study? So the data considered, my interest was in all the Anglophone countries, Anthems, now Anglophone countries, but I had a criteria, so I only included Anthems that were in English, and just because of convenience, linguistic barrier, I included, I think the exception is Somalia. Yeah, Anthems is more recent, and it was composed by a musician, not really intended to be a national anthem. So I excluded the Somalian anthem. So in all, these are short, normally short text. There are 301 clauses and 1,971 or 76 running words. I first looked at the word frequency, around the word frequency of the anthems, identified the top 20 frequent words, which are what I've outlined here. The most frequent word is land, followed by blessed and God, and then others. I did a clause by clause analysis of each anthem using the grammatical system of transitivity. I will not go so much into details that area for technical reasons. But I did a clause by clause analysis. But in the discussion, I focused on clauses that contain these top 20 frequent words. And I realized that there were some themes emerging, and there were some motifs. If you look at these 20 words, there were emerging motifs that I finally grouped into three. which are called motif of freedom, motif of legitimizing the ownership of the land, and motif of invoking divine blessing. The discussion will largely focus on this motif. Another consideration was, I mentioned the translator analysis, to look at what kind of experience is constructed in these anthems. Most of the anthems, or if you like, most of the clauses in the anthems constitute actions or indicate attributes, behaviors, sayings, and very few instances of emotions. So it tells us that although the anthems are normally, if we sing them, very emotional and all of that, these are not coming so much from direct representation of emotions in language. But there are a lot of actions that are projected in the clauses, followed by behaviors of people, attributions of land and people and other. Now the discussion. First, I'll talk about the collective memory, how the anthems reconstruct the colonial experience to give agency to the colonized and project a positive identity for the future. So I first give some excerpts from the anthems. Under this topic, I'll look at first the colonizer, how the colonizer is represented. It's represented as an enemy, how the colonized is represented as an agent hero, and then how colonialism itself is presented. So the anthems generally capture the colonizer as an enemy. And we should underscore that this enemy is presented in a form of a person, but more or less it's a personification of imperialism. So we have clauses like, I'll not read all the text, but I highlighted some essential portions. The first one from the Liberian anthem said, "We will meet the foe with valor unpretending in Ghana, and help us, God help us to resist oppressors' rule, the barbarian enemy humiliatingly defeated." So we have a war situation set up by the anthems with an enemy, and then who is waging obviously an unjustified war, and that is being defeated and fought against. The enemification has been identified as a very powerful tool of resistance that is used to voice support and let the people within a particular society that the discourse is directed at to come together because of the fact that they have a common enemy. And we see this throughout the anthems. It's a very strong motif, the enemification of imperialism, which brings together Africa, or brings together the people of the nation to be focused and act against this enemy. If we look at these anthems, we see that, especially this highlighted part, you see that the agent is the people. We will meet the foe. We resist, or us resist oppressors' rule, and then the barbarian enemy defeated. This is a passive clause. So we defeating the barbarian enemy. So the people are assigned the agency. They are the actors. And then we look at the imperialist as the object that has been acted against and defeated. So we have a template. If you look at clauses that represent these relations, we have a template. The actor is the colonized, normally an action, potent action, and what is impacted upon or affected is the colonizer. So agency is assigned to the colonized. And the colonized emerge as a hero, and we have several abstracts that further illustrate this. even directly using the terms hero or other synonymous expressions. So the ancestors are presented as heroes, the martyrs, and the brave fighters. So we have examples like the labor of our heroes past, victors in the struggle for the right. We have won freedom fight. We praise our heroes' sacrifice, saluting our martyrs whose blood cemented our national foundation. So if you compare those instances that present the colonizer as an enemy, a foe, somebody against the good of humanity, the colonized, the fighters are presented as heroes. They are the victors. They are the ones fighting on the side of the good. Colonialism itself is represented as evil. And this is a narrative against the dominant colonial narrative that subjugated Africa, presenting colonialism as a salvation, presenting colonialism as something good that introduced modernity to Africa, that came as a form of intervention to save us from the wilderness. So we see a form of writing back to the center, writing back in the words of Ashcroft and company, writing back, resisting, and returning this discourse that has been perpetuated by colonialism. So we see the fight against colonialism and the casualties emerging as a form of martyrdom. We have decades of devotion for purpose, liberation. On the other hand, imperialism is captured as slavery, barriers, and other forms of negative words we find in the anthems that shows that colonization is anti-human. In terms of the motifs, freedom is very strong. Out of all the words in the clauses, including functional words, 301, it forms 14% of the words. And it is, if you compare it, it's expressed by the words free or freedom and liberty. Freedom itself occurring like 16 times, liberty, I think also 16 or so times. So put together, we see that they have a high frequency in the anthems. And they occur again in all the anthems as well. So underscoring the importance of this motif. And I look at the clauses more closely and look at what kind of meanings that they construct. And we find that there are different kinds of entities in the anthems of Anglophone Africa. We have God, we have the nation, the citizens, ancestors, concepts, and objects that are represented. Now, if you look at the citizens are normally assigned, so if you look at the actor, is the one acting, engaged in a physical action, a behavior, engaged in some form of behavior, and a career is one that an attribute is assigned to, something like we are brave, right? We see that functions that have to do with agency, okay, being in the forefront in the clause, mostly this will occupy the subject position. They are normally assigned to the citizens, okay? And the next participant in this will be God. The lot of attributes are found in the anthems, normally in the form of concepts or sayings or forms of behavior of the people expressed. And these concepts are normally related to freedom or liberty or some synonyms of these. The point being made here is that the anthems foreground freedom as a human good and something that is justified to fight for, and imperialism, which is against freedom, which is anti-freedom, as negative and need to be hoisted out. We find it very foregrounded in all forms of appearances. It's, if we look at the clauses here, most of it ascribes attributes. It's come as an attribute, proud and free, like free people, stand and sing for Zambia, proud and free. We have one's freedom fight. Here is an adjective, an attribute of the kind of struggle against independence. So the fight is a freedom fight, which needs to be supported. Our freedom personalized here. We have songs of freedom in the behavior, the products of their utterances are characterized as free as well. Strongly emphasize motif. And we look at the, again, if you look at the, in terms of agency, how it's represented, as we said, we normally see it's either the citizens, the ancestors, or God physically acting and then producing freedom. So putting the African people again at the forefront of fighting for freedom. The other motif, which is legitimizing the ownership of land, also expressed by clauses in which where the word land is found, for instance. It's also a very strong motif occurring in all the anthems, almost all, the exception being Tanzania and Eritrea. The clauses where it's represented has similar entities to freedom. We have God, nation or land, citizens, and also concept. Again, obviously, because I was looking at clauses of land, the land or nation has more of the clauses here, but mostly assigned attributes, or it is the goal on which the citizens act to transform. But most of the actors or the agents performing these are again the citizens and to some extent God. The ownership of land, legitimizing the ownership of land is interesting and relevant if you place this within the context of the land struggles that took place during the colonial regime, and even that are still leading to several struggles in the African ex-colonial countries around the world, Zimbabwe, for instance, and other parts of countries, maybe in Southern Africa, experiencing land struggles between white settlers and then Africans. In Ghana, we can talk about the struggles against the land bills, going as far back as the 19th century, where the British Crown passed a bill which was called initially called the Wastelands Bill, and later in the early 20th century revised as the Crown's Land Bill. And this land was to give away the unused lands in Ghana to the British Crown to control and own and to manage in terms of growing foreign investments and for economic development. There was a lot of resistance against this. It led to the formation of the Aborigines Rights Protection Society. There was a delegation sent from Ghana by the local chiefs and through the Queen in England to fight against this bill. This was a success in Ghana. In other places like Zimbabwe, and even Kenya, some of these bills went through, and in Kenya led to the Mau Mau movement. And there was this strong motif across Africa about land issues. The anthems foreground this and highlight this in several ways. I want to highlight more importantly how the anthems presents the land, relate the land to kin relationship, like family relationship. So we have predominant expressions like homeland, motherland, fatherland, our native land, okay, homeland of Kenya, land of mine. And if you look at this together in totality, and the emphasis of kin relationship with the land, it underscores the importance or the significance of land in Africa. For land in Africa is not just an economic resource, but also a spiritual entity, something that we interact with. We have many African cultures who pour libation or offer prayers to the Africa, to the land. It is considered as a heritage from our ancestors, and something that relates to blood, most of the time acquired through blood, defended through blood, and something very significant beyond its economic value of farming, but establishing a connection between the person spiritually with their ancestors. So the homeland, the motherland, and for the fatherland, for the African, has this very strong significance. No wonder it leads to a lot of struggle. It led first in the colonial era, and even in post-independence era, we see a lot of issues coming up, not even with the colonizers, but even internal conflicts relating to land. So we see this motif strongly emphasized in the anthem, but also seen as a form of writing back to the colonizer. We have discourses of colonialism that says that when the colonizer came to Africa, there were different tribes, to use the term tribes, fighting for territories. So they participated, and then they got their portion. So if you go to South Africa, for instance, we have people claiming that, well, they were the Zulu there, they were the Xhosa and other groups, and the whites also came. They all fought for claim ownership of land and all of that. And so they own legitimate rights to the land just as the African. We see this form of resistance writing back, speaking against this ideology in the anthems by showing a kin relationship with the land and emphasizing the land as an identity marker and something that is native and owned by the African and not the colonizer. So if we see free men, we stand under the flag of our land. We look at this beyond the literal meaning, and you look at the motif and how it occurs throughout the anthems, you realize how important this is. The last motif I'll highlight is evoking divine blessing. And here we see a kind of well order in the anthems. And this word well order is related, but in two forms. God is very prominent in all the anthems. And it's normally presented in one of two ways. Either God acts on citizens, and then the citizens in turn act on the nation or react in terms of their desirable emotions or behaviors. Okay, so we have a diagrammatic representation, something like God acting on citizens, citizens acting on the nation, emotions or behaviors, or God directly acting on the nation. So we have a kind of well order, a hierarchy from God to citizens, the nation, emotions, and behaviors here. We can interpret this in two ways. First, when I look at the Ghana National Anthem, my consideration was, okay, so we are not doing anything, it's only God. So God is assigned a very strong agency, for instance, in the Ghana National Anthem, and it is even God that assigns or attributes the positive values that we're supposed to imbibe our citizens on us. So we have, apart from God bless our homeland, we also have Him make our nation great and strong. So God assigning the attributes of great and strong. assigning the attribute of bold to defend, okay, the cause of freedom and rights. God fills our heart with true humility. God makes us cherish fearless honesty. And God help us to resist oppressors who, with all our minds and will forevermore. If you look at, so this is one way of representing it, but this is not dominant throughout the anthems that represent God. Okay, so other representations are also represented with God directly blessing the nation. That is very strong. I think blessing is very strong. And then also protections, and those things are more dominant in the anthems. If you look at these in the context of the issue of cultural trauma that I mentioned and decoloniality, we look at the fight against imperialism as something that goes beyond the realm of the human. It goes beyond the realm of the mundane to engage a divine warfare. And here, God is invited as someone fighting on the side of the colonized, which is the side of good against evil. And we also see that a form of helplessness, a form of danger represented by this evoking of divine blessing, indicating that without a strong force, it will be difficult to achieve decoloniality, which by way for me, I interpret as a traumatic discourse in the sense that the colonized is very much aware of the power and the force and the tenacity of the colonizer and imperialism in general, and calls for a more powerful being that will endorse and then energize the struggle against this evil. Okay, but it also underscores the importance of religion in Africa, as Bishop Inthe says, the African is incurable of religion. Religion is, in his words, he says the African is notoriously religious. And this goes beyond, sometimes people want to associate the believing God with the coming of Christianity or Islam in Africa. But we know that the believing God and religion is generally is very integral and very important to our culture, our being, and the African hardly does anything without invoking the divine. So this also relates to these cultural aspects. But the point being made is that, so these cultural facilities are marshaled to indicate resistance and to forge a war against colonialism and indicate it as something evil against humanity that we need to act against. So we see that most of the anthems that in this context, God is presented as an actor, acting as I mentioned earlier. So this is just a statistical illustration of the world order I showed earlier. So in conclusion, the anthems of Anglophone African countries go beyond celebrating political independence to pursue a decolonial identity for the African people. The African is assigned agency in the struggle of good against evil, and evil here is imperialism. Freedom is foregrounded as a good for humanity and divinely sanctioned. The land is constructed as a God-given resource and a spiritual and economic heritage. And these conclusions have modern significance in our continual struggle against decoloniality. As I mentioned, a lot of discussion on decolonial and the decolonial literature has focused on issues about economy, looking at the sociology of struggle and other things. We often look at discourses, and we very often neglect discourses and their role in decoloniality. And I think that if we emphasize these discourses and bring them to the fight, bring them to the struggle, it will help as well. In the first instance, I'll mention the current issue with the land and resource in Africa generally, which has continued to be problematic. In Ghana, we are very much aware of the Galamsey struggle. We are very much aware of its consequence on other natural resources like the river. And that is not the only one, because it has a direct impact on our environment. But there are many other resources that are still, after colonization has ended, still used in the benefit of the colonizer. The anthems here emphasize the spiritual relevance of these resources and the fact that their heritage from their ancestors that need to be valued and protected. The African is emphasized to be the agent in the struggle and not hold the arms. The idea of freedom as a human good is emphasized. And these issues can be harnessed in developing other national discourses and also promoting not just new discourses, but promoting the use of the anthems in forging or in mentally or psychologically decolonizing the African mind for a more positive African future. Thank you. I think that is, and some references.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mwinlaaru, for this interesting presentation. For most of us as Ghanaians, we just sing the national anthem without paying attention to some of these motifs that you have brought out. And it's interesting. Now, what I would like to do is maybe I'll start with an observation and then open the floor for a discussion. It could be a comment, it could be a question, or some form of suggestion. Okay, so looking at most of the national anthems of Anglophone Africa, you realize that the language is English. Okay, even if we had some of them being translated into other African languages. I know that for Nigeria, for instance, there was from about 6 to 8 indigenous languages. Okay, they've been able to translate their national anthem into those languages. I know for Ghana, there may be some others, we still sing the national anthem in English. That's the language of the colonizer. And I would want to find out how that affects our effort in decoloniality. So after, if you'd want to respond to that, fine. Otherwise, we would ask if anybody has a, all right. All right, so we have our friends online responding. Okay, so now let's listen to Mensa Bonsu, Emmanuel Mensa Bonsu. Then you have your hand up.
Okay, yeah. Please, may I ask my question?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
All right. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Isaac Mwinlaaru for the insightful presentation that he made. And also one comment or one implication that he offered about the land, I think is very crucial in Africa, not just Ghana alone. So I think that is very, very important to that. Well, my question is, I want to know how appropriate the corpus approach that he used was in achieving the purpose of his study.
Emmanuel?
Yes, please.
Yes, please go ahead.
I wanted to know how appropriate the corpus approach was in achieving the purpose of the study, taking the discourses of the anthems into consideration here.
Right. Thank you. I think we will take one more and then we'll give the presenter the opportunity to respond. Do you have any more? Alims, Ayawan.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Mwinlaaru, for the presentation. If I'm allowed to ask two questions at a go, I think you can take the first as a comment and perhaps respond to the second. From the presentation, I get the sense that you buy into the idea of Anglophone African countries falling within or reflecting the status of a post-colony, which implies obviously that the ideologies arising from coloniality are what is underpinning social and political behavior within our context. So given the self-interest of coloniality and preserving the status of the post-colony, how do discourses of resistance arise, right? If the discourse is part or is a brainchild of the post-colonial, which is underpinned by certain ideologies, how do those ideologies refuse to act in their own self-interest by allowing discourses of resistance to arise and through our national anthems, right? So that's the first. Quickly, the second is that I was hoping to hear your theorization of agency. So for instance, if something assigns agency to another thing, so in the anthems, you make the argument that so the discourses may assign agency to a certain feature of the discourse, maybe God or the individuals that have a presence within the anthems. Once agency is assigned to you by something else, to what extent do you have real agency? Right? If you assign me power, to what extent do I actually have power? When it is that the power actually comes from you, right? So a bit on your theorization of agency, if you want to. Thank you.
And then the second round comes.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. So I'll start with the first on the use of English in the anthems. Yes, it's on the one hand, it is sad how African languages are, let's say, marginalized within the African continent and in our national development. Very few countries pay very serious attention to the use of African languages. And it will be important, of course, to have versions of the national anthems in local languages. In Ghana, I think what happens is there are other anthems that are different. So they are originally composed in the local languages, like Yen Araya Sasini. But what we often officially see as the national anthem is rendered in English alone. Other countries, as you said, have translated them. South Africa has translated the anthem to several languages. But the issue, on the other hand, the issue of English is interesting and very difficult to normally talk about in our contemporary world. Looking at the issue of globalization, which is again is important in talking about decoloniality, because globalization, in fact, is defined. There's a center. The center of globalization is the North American, or the West, and North. The center is North America and the West, Western Europe, more generally Western Europe. So the English can be seen, especially its modern presence is seen within this context of globalization, which again comes with the coloniality, the issue of coloniality and other things. One thing that is let's say fighting against the decolonial agenda is that very globalization modernity. It's not a bad thing, but the fact that it comes from a center that consciously tries to control the others. So English is continuously used as a tool of power. So telling us that even in the context where decoloniality is taking place, coloniality is also very much present and taking the lead. Yeah, but I should also add that decoloniality is some aspect of it. Some people will research on decoloniality, will try to glorify Africa, try to focus on what is African and other things, but more largely it goes beyond, or is not really, most of it is not about reversing modernity or reversing the contemporary to an original Africa. That is not the point, but it is about doing away with the evil, the control of the economy, the control of destinies of the people that imperialism is negatively affecting against, what the people Fanon will call the wretched of the earth. And on that, it's quite an ambiguous thing, especially when you talk about English. And these days, people talk about we owning, there's a paper by one of my colleagues, owning the other tongue, talk about English use in Ghana. Yeah, so the issue of modernity, globalization is there. But what we can do is to see how we can let our local languages also come to the center to participate, not necessarily replace, but to share in the space and the order that has been established by the powers that be. Emmanuel, yes, so I mentioned the frequency counts I did for the words, but I actually did not do a corpus analysis because I had intended to, but when I had the anthems, I was certain that it wasn't a large text, so just 301 clauses and all of that. So it's something you could easily analyze. And my analysis also, I was interested in the clause analysis. But what I did with I used the ANCON anyway, but my interest there was strictly to look at the most frequent words to see what aspects of the data I should pay more attention to, or to see the motifs, as I said. Yes, so I didn't really use the corpus analysis method approach. And the more challenging question from Alims on the how do the discourses of resistance strive in the post-colony. Yes, we see that decoloniality even when colonialism as an administration system was active, and even the slave-free time, there were forms of resistance. And decoloniality had been present, and it was part of the struggle against the colonial rule that led to independence. Looking at it as the forms of discourses that were propagated, that were developed to get people motivated to fight for independence, to get people to act against the colonial system and all of that are part of the enterprise of decoloniality. So the issue of resistance has been there from the very beginning, which makes, so that is why we look at this, if you look at the anthems, they present it as a form of war, the enemy, and then the fighter, or the good fight against the good and the evil. So to answer your question, it's a struggle. The two are existing. So we have the post-colony, decoloniality discourses are still acting within these as post-colony as a form of resistance. Some anthems like that of the United States, and then consider if those elements you're talking about were not present. So I think if you do that, then all these things you are talking about will become much sharper. Because I mean, except for perhaps Liberia, which was also not technically colonized. Ghana was the first to have had the independence, and even just looking at the flag of Ghana, and a number of flags in West Africa and even across Africa, you notice that Ghana had such an influence on many countries. And perhaps one of such would be even the wording of the national anthem. And so that is just a comment. And with agency, as the other person mentioned, with the motifs, you talked about three of them, freedom, heroizing, the freedom fighters, okay, and then you're talking about legitimization of the land, and then divine intervention. And you are situating all these things. So the comment on the anthem of which is related to what Comfort just asked, also the first issue on the anthems of other nations like US, perhaps UK and others that have not been colonized before, and whether the Ghana national anthem influenced others. Yes, I didn't include other nations in this, but I looked at literature on anthems in other places. The D'Souza, I think 2008, and then there is another paper, maybe 2005. He looked at anthems of a more wider Anglophone Anglophone countries, so more generally around the world. And if you, including the anthem by the US and then the UK. And you, of course, you see the similarity you find will be the evoking of divine. But on the other hand, you see a very different representation. If you compare the colonized nations to the US, UK, for instance, talking about God Save the King. That's how it starts. So the Queen, now the King, right? And then if you look at the countries in America, colonized nations there, look at those in Africa, we think that they are photocopies, which is very interesting for me. And although I made things for Africa, I look at other nations that are colonized around the world, that the anthems evoke very similar things. Land, God, and others. Very strong in the Caribbean, Latin America. Anglophone anthems there, but in the Caribbean, for instance. There's also a paper by the section of African countries, including French, and also very similar representations of Francophone countries, colonized countries. They don't analyze the anthems from my perspective, but I picked their text just to look at the anthems that they have included. and how different or similar they are to what I'm talking about. Some of them, apart from issues, the rest are not really linguistic anyway. They are sociology, from sociology departments and all of that. Yes, but you look at the text of the anthems, you find very similar things there. So whereas this representation will not be peculiar to Africa, it will be more similar or general to people, similar contexts where colonization and decoloniality is important. And the influence of Ghana, yes, I have spotted, if not Ghana, I think I've spotted this kind of suggestion somewhere. The influence of the British anthem on the African countries, especially the Anglophone. I think in D'Souza's work, because of the reference to God, he interpreted it as because God is there, that is why. But if you look at the anthem one after the other, and then take to them collectively, and even comparing the issues, as I said, to other data in the Caribbean, then it strikes you to look beyond influence. People may not necessarily have just tried to copy, but it's because of the shared experiences. That is how I interpret it. The shared experiences that colonialism brought, that will be leading to the similarity. If you look at the issue of land, it went across all over. Okay. Of course, the issue of freedom, obviously, coming at the dawn of independence, expected and all of that. So, of course, I will not rule out the influence, but then I'll think the similarity of experience will be a stronger factor. And the selection of the anthems, well, the anthems, of course, are national narratives. And narratives, for every situation, there are different narratives. The anthems are speaking against a particular narrative that has been constructed. And this is also a form of narrative. And they were selected from several options. I think there were several options people presented anthems, these were chosen. So it relates to the issue of heterogeneity that was raised in the last questionnaires. So there is heterogeneous perspectives. That is fine. Different perspectives presented, different forms of music. Music was very key in the independence struggle and even after. Even with high life and all of that, music was very important. But the anthems are selected, of course, to present a particular narrative. We look at it as a national narrative against other narratives that may be available. So a form of a canon, yes. So it is not, so if you look at it as an ideological piece, then we are right, because it is not objective, really presenting. And even if you look at D'Souza's work, which I was talking about, he talks about the fact that if you look at these countries that claim common ancestry, common history, it's an ideological thing, because we know that we were several states before colonization, before we came together, and there is not that common, okay? So the presentation of the common human history, the common inspiration, and common, these are all ideologies that have been forged to fight, and that is why it has to do with decoloniality, a form of discourse created fight against another discourse. Yeah, so there's that ideological base there. So I'll just maybe relate this to your question on the heterogeneity and whether the anthems present. Yes, I'll agree with you on that point.
Who you are.
yes, the anthems present a particular perspective, a preferred perspective by those who compiled or who selected them, and we can look at them as a kind of a canon. As whether they don't express the issue of the complexity involved. I'll defer that. I will not say yes or no. Maybe I will have to look at it later more closely, see whether that complexity emerges. Yeah. Some of the things may not have been available to the kind of analysis I did, so I can look at them again. Yes. Still, I think the general assassination, which I've often played and tried to compare with the Ghana anthems. You will see that even it's written in the local languages. You compare it to the anthems I've presented. They're still very similar. The land, Yen Ara Yassasini, a board in the Mayam, which are Nananum Fiegu or that spiritual connection. The themes, the language, it still resonates with the general corpus of anthems within the African milieu. But yes, if you are looking at it within the Ghanaian context, comparing the two anthems, personally, I prefer the Yen Ara Yassasini. For instance, I think that it speaks to the general spreads, even if you look at the range of data that the African anthems present. And also do not construct that double agency of God and then the people. Yeah. So it is a more powerful, and it's not surprising that we find it sung at independence when the military are singing, and many other public gatherings. The military band will sing the Yen Ara Yassasini, which may be conscious or unconscious, but it may resonate with the spirit of this of patriotism, which we find the military to be a symbol of. Okay. The issue of agency and the colonized, neo-colonized states. Okay, non-colonized state. I think what Comfort talked about that, whether if you compare, I think I indirectly answered that. I've been looked at non-colonized countries in Africa. I haven't looked at that, but as I said, I've looked at other anthems by colonized states in other parts of the world. The agency is very much the same. And if you look at the superpowers, maybe the two, UK and US, which are the only ones I've also considered, they are very different. So perhaps I may have to look at what Ethiopia presents and what Liberia may also present. I haven't looked at. I think Liberia is included in my anthems anyway, although it's not directly colonized, but I haven't checked Ethiopia. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a few comments and I think one question. The chat window. And because of time, I'm going to be reading them out. If you need to respond, then you do that. You can do that now, fine. Otherwise, the conversation can take place after here. So from Patrick Hamofa, he says, please, why do Africans define injustice in the context of their national anthem? Okay, that's the question. Why do Africans define injustice in the context of their national anthem? And we have this from Joshua Amwete. I think this is just a comment. He said, Kenya has beers in Swahili. Fine. And then there's also another question from Emmanuel and Nim. He said, what is the difference between neo-colonialism and coloniality? Then there's another question. So please, why do Africans define that? Okay, no. So there's one comment. I don't know whether you want to. And that will bring us to the end of the session.
Okay. Let me start with the last one. The difference between neocolonialism and coloniality. So I will say that neocolonialism is attributed to Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And the concept of coloniality, let's say that it's a newer term, coloniality, decoloniality, newer than neocolonialism. But the point is that the phenomenon has been there before the term. And we can say that there are other terms that have been used before that we can interpret or talk about as coloniality, and neocolonialism will be one of them. So Dr. Nkrumah wrote a book. He says neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, and characterizes it as the most dangerous stage. Even telling us that even when independence was attained, at the dawn of independence, the strugglers were very much aware that the story hasn't ended. Yeah, so in that sense, neocolonialism and coloniality, as neocolonialism used by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, they overlap. The difference would be that coloniality underscores the fact that the phenomenon that preceded independence, the phenomenon precedes independence, it goes as far back as even before colonization started, okay, and leading into the post-independence era. So the Nkrumah's term emphasizes a new form, maybe looking at contrasting it with administrative colonialism, all right? But where coloniality is more emphasizing the psychological aspects, the control aspects, systems set up to run without the administrator being present. So there's that overlapping. Okay, so the neocolonialism is talking about a different administrative setup that is going to continue with colonization. But neocoloniality is looking far back behind before even the independence started. So there's that overlapping there. Yes, yeah, so Kenya and Swahili, yes. So there are several countries, they either have the anthems in two versions, English and their native language, or they have different ones, like Ghana, we have Yenara, Yasasini, and others, where a country had different renditions that included the English only, and where there is only, if it's a translation as well, I'll include the English, which is mostly I'll have the one that is written and translated. Why injustice in the context of the national anthem of Ghana? You mentioned Ghana, right? In African countries. Yes, because the colonial enterprise itself is an injustice against humanity. It is something that disrespects, it tries to enforce racism and show some people to be subhuman or less human than others. And we all saw this, even the fiscal effects, transporting people as labor to other parts of the world to work. And so there's that form of injustice. People die, people, futures and destinies are defined negatively by. So this is a form of injustice that we all encounter. Yeah. So that is very much in the spirit of the decolonial discourse. Yeah. So maybe just a final comment, as I said, that so decoloniality is really not about reversing Africa, okay, but it's about getting rid of the injustice. A more inclusive world, a world where the world order is defined to respect everybody and let everybody has a form of articulate or freely enact a form of identity and freedom that is appropriate to their context and dispensation. So that is the point that I also see these anthems emphasizing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mwinlaaru. With that, we come to the end of today's session of our seminar presentation for the historical study. Thank you very much for coming to share this knowledge with us. It's an eye-opener.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
So I hand over to the coordinator, Dr. Abubakar, to tell us what to expect next week.
Thank you, Dr. Kuku. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Kukian, and thank you too for making time to check this seminar. And we expect to see you again next time. It's been very insightful. We are happy to come.
Okay, thank you.
So next week, we have another very interesting presentation, and this time it's an industry person who is an architect. So we expect architect Daniel Pejote in the house next week, and he will give us a talk on vernacular architecture and ecotourism in Ghana, the journey of Safari Valley Resort. So next week, kindly make time to join us in house. And it is also online. We are very happy to have you experience seminar. So thank you once again for making time, and see you next week.